Welcome Internet to Psychologist Casual Review, and today we're going to be reviewing The Allure of the Bad Object by Eleanor Armstrong-Perlman. So it's a very short article that she wrote in the 80s, and it's based on her clinical experience and mainly in her experience in institutions. And what she starts off with is a very interesting fact that most hospitalizations are due or are related to the loss of a relationship that often for most people it doesn't come out of nowhere. What sparks it is the termination or the loss of a presence or another person. And she's going to explain that this is by no means a moment of randomness. This is due to the fact that these people are reliving in the present a past traumatic experience with their primary caregivers, and that past experience is being reactualized, i.e. it's happening in the present as it echoes to the past. So this is very important because this is going to be the premise of all this article, that basically these moments of intense and acute, for example, psychotic episodes, depressive episodes, are intertwined with past traumatic relationships. And she's going to explain very well that these people that are hospitalized often are not people that will always be hospitalized or are unachieving or blocked in their lives. Often they can be very high achieving individuals. They can be very profoundly good at what they do. They can even be a real asset to their communities. However, at certain points they break down. Why? Because they have lost the relationship. A relationship which basically caused a lot of investment and turmoil in their minds. But that turmoil is incredibly intense, and they have a sort of feeling of fulfillment through that intensity of the relationship. An intensity that is basically burning them, but it also maintains them in a sense of reality, that they feel more real than they've ever been in that toxic, as we would now say, relationship. So basically they're both alive but burning through that relationship. And what Armstrong-Perlman is going to explain is that it's by no means a coincidence. This is because they're replaying relationships that they've had in the past, and mainly to caregivers. So Armstrong-Perlman is going to basically explain Fernburn's theory that fundamentally these issues are due to, in the past, the child was stuck with parents that were both infinitely exciting and infinitely frustrating. So how so? Well, basically infinitely exciting because they were always tantalizing the hope of a perfect relationship, of basically infinite love, and the child believed that, and they had no other choice than to believe this, that they felt that they could achieve full love. Issue is that they were as frustrating as they were exciting, because the other side of this coin is that the parent never gave what the child needed. They never basically adhered to their needs, meaning that the child had to fundamentally repress their own needs in order to try and fulfill those of the parents, to try and basically save the relationship of the parents. A dynamic that can also be found in adulthood, that she explains that many people who she has met in these dynamics felt that they could save the other toxic individual, fix them even. And she says that this is basically to tie in with a feeling of omnipotence that the child might have, that they might be able to save the parent, that this time they're going to be able to do it and change the relationship, and the relationship will become good. So what she explains is that under the age of 10, a child, and she quotes Bowlby on this, a child cannot consciously accept that they're at the hands of a bad parent. That's frightening, it's terrifying, it's almost a form of self-annihilation. Therefore, what's going to happen is that the child is going to, when the parent is bad, the child is going to try and find an explanation, a reason of why the parent is bad. And what the conclusion they're gonna come towards is that they themselves are bad, and the parent is only bad because they're bad. Therefore, if they change, the parent will change. In this logic, the child cannot see the flawed adult for who they are because it's too scary to imagine a parent that's wrong or evil or just broken. So the child creates that dynamic. What she does not quote this, but what Fernburn calls a moral defense, i.e., the child's going to absorb all of the guilt, all of the shame, all of the pain of the parent, and basically internalize it and make it part of his inner world. However, the problem with that is that it's a way of trying to control what the experience that's happening to them, but it's bound to fail because the child needs to have their needs met. Okay? So the child has to have their needs met by the parents, but the other way around does not work. It breaks down the child and weakens the sense of self, or what Fernburn called the central ego, i.e., basically they're lost in the will of the parent. And what Armstrong-Perlman explains that by being lost, what's going to happen is that the child is going to go to, not to object seeking, but to drives. So here she explains this very interestingly enough, that there's a shift in the paradigm, i.e., instead of seeking a relationship, the child is going to seek basically his drives or to fulfill the relationship by other means. And what she talks about that is that, for example, a child can do that through, for example, food or through toys or basically or any other apparatus, but adults can do it also by addiction, sexuality, perversions, and basically it's the same mechanism of because the relationship is not met and the needs that the child has for a relationship are not met by the caregiver, the child has to find a substitute. And that substitute in adulthood is incredibly destructive and self-hurting, but it's still a form of bond, it's still a form of link, because it's still better than nothing. And this is the whole problem of this dynamic, is that suffering, pain, and destruction are better than nothing. A bad object is better than no object, and a bad relationship is better than no relationship, because the child has never been able to integrate their own needs, so therefore they feel that they have to fulfill those of others. The unconscious fantasy being once the others has been fulfilled, at some point they will be able to come back and fulfill theirs. Like if I purge my parent of all the badness, then he will become good again and take care of me. This is the underlying logic. It's logic that never happens, as, for example, another author called David Salami points out, that just doesn't happen. That dynamic only goes one way, but this is the unconscious fantasy of the child in this dynamic. And what she's going to explain, so she's going to, I'm talking about here of the author Armstrong-Perlman, she's going to explain that fundamentally the core process of psychotherapy is to be able for the adult, now that he basically can take care of his own needs, to understand what he has never got, to understand what has happened to him, to be able to name that trauma that happened in childhood, because often patients are not even aware that it was that traumatic, or they might even excuse the parent, saying it was a broken or damaged individual, my parent did what they could. Often some even might not be even aware of the neglect or the abuse that they have experienced. This is because as a child that was too hard, too painful, too destructive, therefore they had to split the representation of the relationship between an exciting, frustrating, but they also had to split themselves, their egos, in order to be able to live another day and not fall into absolute despair. The issue is that it created a division between an exciting and hopeful self, which is completely prisoner of an idealized relationship. Nothing to do with the ideal object of Fernburn, right? Really, just the person is completely like wowed by this idea of an absolutely good relationship, or it's completely frustrating. And one goes with the other, right? It's the exciting object is also the rejecting object. I.e., what I'm trying to say is that there is no such thing as an infinitely exciting individual without them being infinitely frustrating at the same time, in the same relationship. But for the person living this subjectively, there is a difference. In one case, for example, when it's completely exciting, the individual might not even realize what is happening. They might not realize how the other individual is hurting them, and they might even refuse to listen to anyone else speaking this truth to them. And they might reject it in block because they don't realize it. That's the libidinal ego. There is no room for any criticism. The other, and as Armstrong-Perlman points out, the other becomes an ideal ego for the individual, that basically they have become everything to them. It's only in a second phase of complete rejection that the individual can fight back and basically be more, how can I say, feisty and powerful and frightened. However, in both cases, it doesn't lead to separation. What leads to separation is this deep understanding, that is often brought forth by psychotherapy, of what basically the person is experiencing. Because problem is, no one has ever named that dynamic for many people. Therefore, it is up to the therapist to be able to name it, to be able to interpret it, to put meaning into it, and to help the patient understand that what they're experiencing at present is the repetition of something much deeper, something that goes back to the very early childhood and infancy. And often, as Armstrong-Perlman points out at the very end, this framing helps the patient withdraw from it, or to build a more of a centralized self, or central ego, if we were to use Fernburn's vocabulary. The idea here is basically the individual can learn how to take care of themselves and build more stable relationships, ones that are not infinitely exciting and not infinitely frustrating, ones that are in a way ambivalent. So in this text, and I need to make precision, in this text she talks about ambivalence, in the fact of having that exciting and frustrating dynamic. I was not using it in this way. I was using it more in a Freudian way of both at the same time, good and bad at the same time, right? Rather than one or the other. Ambivalence being the opposite of splitting. I'm making this distinction because Armstrong-Perlman uses it in an interesting way, but it's not the normal way of using the word ambivalence, which is okay, right? No criticism. It's just I'm making a little touch that basically what's important is for therapy to be able to unite the person enough for them to be able to understand that the relationship is both good and bad at the same time. That it's yes, but, rather than it's yes, it's incredible, or yes, it's perfect, or no, it's complete destructive, or no, I'm afraid of them, right? So it's about unification, and that's the big point of Armstrong-Perlman, and it's something I fundamentally agree with. So very lastly, this text is incredibly good. If you have never read Fernburn or are a bit intimidated by starting with Fairy, I would highly recommend to start with this short text of a couple of pages, because you can get the baseline ideas of Fernburn in a very readable way, right, and in a very accurate manner. I found the text to be very good and very precise in what she was talking about. The only diversion might be with the term ambivalent, but as I was saying, it's a completely, like, let's say, okay way of using it. It's just not the average or normal psychoanalytic way of using it. But that's completely fine. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this review. If you want to leave a comment, feel free to do so, and I will answer them. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.